The lights in Gaza hadn't flickered in days. Not from power but from fire. And yet, just before dawn on Friday, as jets roared overhead and rubble buried what was left of the living, an encrypted message was quietly sent out from a darkened tunnel beneath the city. It read only one sentence. "We are ready." For the first time in months of relentless violence, something moved. Something unexpected. Hamas, the group Israel had vowed to destroy, sent word. They were willing to talk. But this wasn't just another empty statement buried in press releases and politics. It was a shift. The kind of shift that stops wars or escalates them. Hamas announced it had submitted a positive response to a new ceasefire proposal. 60 days. No fire. No drones. No airstrikes. It wasn't peace, but it was pause. And in this war that meant everything. Inside underground bunkers, behind shattered buildings and barricaded gates, both sides were bracing for another day of death. But now a possibility emerged. Not hope, not yet, but calculation. What viewers didn't see on the headlines was what followed immediately after that message was sent. A complete communications lockdown in Gaza's top command. No chatter. No leaks. Only one word passed between commanders in person. Proceed. This was not just about survival. It was about terms, timing, and truth. Across the border, Israeli intelligence had already predicted this moment. According to an insider, they knew Hamas would respond. They'd rewritten the proposal, carefully choosing their words, reshaping the offer not with trust, but with pressure. The offer didn't promise victory. Promised less death. Inside Israel's war rooms, maps were lit up in red. Drones returned with fresh footage. Civilian shelters overflowed. Yet behind the noise of war, another message passed through military channels. They blinked. But not everyone in Israel saw this as a chance. To some it was a trap. To others a window. In a midnight meeting at an undisclosed military site, a debate erupted. Not about whether to respond, but whether to believe. Could Hamas be trusted with a deal? Or was this just the next move in a long psychological game? What no one could deny, though, was that the machinery of diplomacy had roared back to life. Qatar stepped in instantly, opening up back-channel lines between the two sides. These weren't video calls or formal summits. They were shadow negotiations, passed hand-to-hand like contraband intelligence in a spy film. At the same time, U.S. officials, working quietly through Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, doubled down. Trump, now deeply invested in making the ceasefire happen, had one message. No delays. No games. Make it happen. In Gaza, families listened to the bombs and hoped the silence that might come after wouldn't be the silence of death, but the silence of ceasefire. The game was no longer about who had the most weapons. It was about who would move first. Who would blink next? Who would survive the deal, and who might be destroyed by it? And this was just the first hour. At 3:42 a.m., a low-flying drone circled above northern Gaza. Its camera wasn't scanning for targets. It was watching a specific alley. Below, a man in civilian clothes stepped into the open, carrying nothing but a folded slip of paper. He looked up once, just once, and vanished into the dark. That paper would ignite the fastest round of back-channel negotiations since the war began. The public heard positive response. But behind that phrase was a code, a hidden mechanism designed to test every wire holding the region together. Hamas didn't just say yes. They submitted what insiders called a positive reframe. They tweaked the proposal. Subtle changes, enough to show cooperation, but firm enough to demand new terms. It was a message laced with both compliance and caution. We'll talk, but we won't beg. In Doha, Qatar's diplomatic team was already awake. They'd seen this move before. But this time was different. The wording suggested Hamas was now willing to accept something it had rejected for months. The possibility of a future without war. In Washington, the language was analyzed line by line. Intelligence officials cross-checked the tone. Amendments was the word Hamas used. Not objections. Not rejections. It was enough for the U.S. to greenlight movement. Fast. By mid-morning, silence fell over Tel Aviv's most secure situation room. Not a single word was spoken as Israel's war cabinet reread the response. Then, a single sentence from a senior official. "They're trying to end it." Quietly. But what did ending mean? The ceasefire plan wasn't simple. It wasn't even safe. 10 Israeli hostages would be released. Some alive, some not. The first day would see 8 returned. No parades. No celebrations. No propaganda. Just silence. It was a gesture stripped of victory, designed not to win hearts, but to lower the temperature. In return, Israel would release Palestinian prisoners, numbers still undisclosed, and perhaps more critically, begin withdrawing troops from parts of northern Gaza. That single phrase, "parts of," sparked arguments that nearly unraveled the whole deal. How much territory? How quickly? What if the withdrawal was ambushed? Every move had to be perfect or the whole thing could explode. Literally. Meanwhile, Qatar acted as the ghost between two fires. Messages passed room to room in silence, never face to face. Proximity talks. Two enemies in the same building, never meeting. Every word, every pause was measured. And then came the wild card, Trump's direct pressure. On Truth Social he posted publicly, "This deal will not get better. It will only get worse." Some called it arrogance. Others called it strategy. But one thing was clear, it spooked the room. For the first time, both sides feared losing the deal. Outside, Gaza burned. Inside, papers shuffled. Guards stood stiff. The world didn't know it yet, but the clock had started. And in 60 hours, either a fragile calm would begin, or history would record another failure in a war built on decades of them. But inside one building, one sentence kept repeating, whispered like a code. "If they blink again, we move." The room was too quiet for a war room. 10 men. 2 women. No handshakes, no small talk. And on the table, a single printed document. Its title read, "Ceasefire Framework Proposal. Phase 1. No one touched it. No one even looked at each other. Because they all knew, whoever blinked first lost. 4 years, the Israeli Security Cabinet had been a place of calculated dominance. But tonight it was a minefield. Prime Minister Netanyahu sat at the head of the table, back straight, face carved in stone. Across from him, his far-right allies, who saw any deal with Hamas as surrender. To them, peace was not the end goal. Total destruction of Hamas was. But something had changed. Something inside Netanyahu himself. Weeks ago, he wouldn't have entertained a proposal like this. But after the clash with Iran, and the near collapse of Israel's international support, his tone had shifted. And now, for the first time in months, he was seriously weighing an outcome that didn't involve tanks, airstrikes, or fire. A whisper moved through the room. "If we bring the hostages home, we bring the country back together." It was a sentence meant for hearts, not politics. But the far right wasn't buying it. "Withdraw troops for 8 people. One minister snapped. "What happens when they reload and hit us harder?" Across the room, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant raised a hand. "This isn't about trust," he said. "It's about leverage. Every hostage we bring back weakens them more than any bomb." Silence followed. But not agreement. A senior intelligence advisor handed Netanyahu a classified file. Inside, aerial surveillance, intercepted messages, and Hamas's exact wording from their proposal amendments. Not a single line promised they'd disarm. Not a single word guaranteed they wouldn't rearm. But for the first time, they didn't demand full withdrawal before releasing hostages. It was a pattern shift. Small but significant. Still, Netanyahu faced a deeper war, one inside his own coalition. Accept the deal, and the far right could fracture his government. Refuse it, and families across Israel would never forgive him for leaving hostages to die. He looked down at the file again, then at the proposal. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. Ron Dermer, his closest advisor and now back from Washington, broke the silence. "Trump wants this locked before Monday." You meet him at the White House. If you go with nothing, you lose everything. Netanyahu's eyes didn't move. But one finger tapped the table. Slow, deliberate. One of the generals spoke up, voice calm but cold. Sir, this is not a ceasefire. This is a controlled retreat. A long pause followed. Then Netanyahu said only one thing. Bring me the vote. Because this was no longer about one man. Or one party. It was now about a decision that could end, or reignite, a war in less than 24 hours. 15 meters underground, beneath a collapsed school and 3 layers of concrete rubble, a steel door slammed shut. The sound echoed like a gunshot down the narrow tunnel. Inside, lit only by red emergency lights, sat 6 men with laptops, radios, and one printed copy of the ceasefire proposal. Creased, dirt-stained, and surrounded by loaded rifles. This wasn't a boardroom. This was Hamas's nerve center. And no one in it believed the war was over. The world saw statements, news flashes. Oh, but underground there was no celebration. There was calculation. Trust had no place here. Only timing did. The man leading the meeting was known only as the engineer. His face never appeared on screens. His voice never recorded. But his orders shaped every move Hamas made. He read the proposal again, slower this time. Not looking for promises, looking for traps. 10 hostages. Israeli withdrawal from parts of the north. Qatar as the mediator. It all sounded clean. Almost too clean. He circled one phrase. Withdrawing from key urban positions. What does that mean? He asked, not looking up. A young field commander replied. It means they'll pull back from the visible streets. But keep snipers in towers. Drones in the sky. And artillery just over the line. The engineer nodded. Exactly. Around the room, digital maps glowed, showing underground tunnels, storage caches, and active fighter zones. The moment Israel pulled back, the front line would shift, not vanish. The ceasefire, if accepted, would buy time. But how would that time be used? Some commanders argued to use it to rest, rearm, redistribute forces. Others, including the engineer, warned that Israel might use it to gather intelligence, prepare new routes, and cripple Gaza from within. Then came the human dilemma, hostages. The first release was set for 8 living captives. No media. No flags. No Hamas banners. Just quiet release into the hands of Red Crescent officials. One commander scoffed. We're surrendering without leverage. But the engineer didn't see it that way. No, he said. We're buying oxygen. For our people. For our strategy. For what's coming next. What Hamas wanted most wasn't written in the proposal, but it was hidden between the lines. An end to the war, full withdrawal, and the right to remain in power. Israel's silence on these issues spoke louder than any promise. And that silence was dangerous. Still, something was changing. For the first time in months, there were no airstrikes overhead. The usual background hum of Israeli drones had paused, if only for a moment. But no one in this bunker believed in peace. They believed in patterns. And they knew this quiet was temporary. One officer turned to the others. If we give them 60 days, we need to be 120 days ahead. They all nodded. Above ground, Gaza's skies were still gray with smoke. Below, Hamas was reading every word of the ceasefire like a battlefield map. And they weren't planning for peace. They were preparing for the next phase, whatever that might mean. At exactly 6:03 p.m., a mother walked into the heart of Tel Aviv's government plaza with a photograph pinned to her chest. Her son's face stared out beneath the words. 74 days in Gaza. Still alive. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Because by the time she stood still, 50 more families had joined her, holding pictures, sobbing silently, staring directly into the windows of power. They weren't asking for justice. They were demanding something more terrifying. Accountability. Inside the government complex, you could hear them chanting. Not screaming. Chanting. Soft, rhythmic, unstoppable. Bring them home. Bring them home. Bring them home. For weeks, the government had made speeches about security, about strategy, about long-term goals. But the families were done listening. Their loved ones weren't numbers in negotiations. They were hostages living minute to minute in underground rooms, unsure if they'd ever see sunlight again. One woman, whose daughter was taken from a border village in October, hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night. Every time a bomb fell in Gaza, she wondered if it landed where her daughter might be. Now, she was on national television, gripping a microphone with trembling hands and saying, "If you let this deal fall apart, you let them die. Not Hamas. Not war. You." It hit like a hammer. And inside the Knesset, lawmakers, many of whom had stood firm against negotiation, began to break. They were being haunted, not by Hamas but by public grief. An internal poll leaked that evening showed a stunning shift. 67% of Israeli citizens now favored accepting the ceasefire if it meant hostages came home safely. The war was no longer just fought with weapons, it was fought with pressure. And the pressure was working. But there was a fear, deep, unspoken. What if the ceasefire brought only partial returns? What if only a few came back alive? What if bodies were sent in silence? Would it still be worth it? In a closed-door session, an opposition leader said something few had dared say out loud. "If we don't sign this deal, and just one of them is killed tomorrow, the streets will never forgive us." Outside, the protests grew. Not in rage, but in grief that burned like fire. Some held signs with only names. Others with bloody handprints. Some just stood there, with nothing but a blank stare. It was the kind of pain that politicians fear. Not because it's loud, but because it doesn't go away. Meanwhile, back at the negotiation table, this silent movement was reshaping the terms. Mediators from Qatar and the US began pressuring both sides harder, because they now knew this was the moment. The people had turned. And when public grief turns into public demand, no government, no matter how strong, walks away untouched. Back in the plaza, a boy no older than 9 held up a sign. "Bring back my sister. I will wait here every day." And that night, under the glow of government floodlights, he did. The room was soundproof. No phones allowed. No aides. Just 3 negotiators, 2 interpreters, and a printed document. On page 11, paragraph 4, line 6. There it was. One sentence. It read, "All military operations shall cease unconditionally for 60 days, pending progress toward a permanent cessation." 14 words. But to one man in the room, it read like betrayal. Steve Witkoff, Trump's hand-picked envoy, put down the paper and looked directly at the Qatari negotiator across from him. "This line," he said quietly, "will blow up the entire deal." The room froze. It wasn't the words that caused the problem. It was what they didn't say. To the Americans, that line meant temporary calm. To Israel it meant strategic handcuffs. And to Hamas it was their last card, a hint that the war might truly, finally end. But there were no guarantees. No definitions. Just pending progress. And in the world of Middle Eastern diplomacy, pending was the word people died under. The Israeli envoy leaned forward, visibly agitated. "Unconditional ceasefire. That's not what we agreed to. Where's the clause about reciprocal action?" The Qatari diplomat, calm and unreadable, flipped to another page. "Reciprocity is implied in implementation. But if we spell it out, Hamas walks." The pressure was electric. Outside the room, protests were growing in both Tel Aviv and Gaza. The hostages' families were marching again. Social media feeds burned with speculation. Journalists guessed, analysts spun theories. But inside this windowless chamber, one word was threatening to bring it all crashing down. That night, sleep was a luxury no one could afford. Steve Witkoff stood and paced the room, arms folded. "Look," he said. "Trump's flying in from Bedminster tomorrow. Netanyahu's cabinet meets in 36 hours. If we don't get this line rewritten in the next 2, the whole thing collapses." A silence hung in the air. The clock ticked. Then, for the first time in 18 hours of non-stop talks, The Qatari lead negotiator finally broke posture. You want progress defined. Fine. We'll write. Pending mutually acknowledged steps toward permanent cessation, monitored by third-party actors. It was a gamble. Israel wanted accountability. Hamas wanted ambiguity. The Americans wanted a deal. Witkoff nodded slowly. The Israeli envoy grunted but didn't object. And with a single pen stroke, the sentence was changed. One sentence. That was all it took to bring the deal back from the edge of collapse. But it wasn't over. Because even as the ink dried on that revised clause, new intelligence came in. Hamas was relocating its fighters. Not in violation, not as an attack, but as preparation. Were they preparing for peace? Or preparing for betrayal? No one knew. But in that sealed room, as the revised document was passed between trembling hands, every man inside understood one thing. This wasn't just a ceasefire. It was a countdown. And the next move could still blow it all apart. At precisely 7 a.m., the shelling stopped. No gunfire. No drones. No sirens. Just silence. A sound so unfamiliar it felt dangerous. Then, from the northern edge of Gaza, a white ambulance began moving slowly down a bombed-out road. No flags. No armed escort. Just 2 medics. And 8 lives held in the balance. This was the first exchange. The ceasefire was real now. Not just on paper, not in press briefings, but in motion. And that made it more fragile than ever. The world held its breath. Inside the ambulance were 8 Israeli hostages. Malnourished, blindfolded, some barely able to sit upright. Their hands were tied with strips of cloth, not ropes. Hamas had been ordered. No cameras, no speeches, no victory songs. The release had to happen in complete silence, per the agreement. A deal breaker if violated. On the Israeli side, military medics stood by, flanked by Red Crescent officials. Helicopters hovered far in the distance but were ordered not to come closer. Not yet. The entire exchange zone had been marked as zero-activity corridor. One mistake, one twitch of a finger on a rifle trigger, and the ceasefire would evaporate in seconds. Then, slowly, the ambulance doors opened. The first hostage stepped out, a girl maybe 19. She shielded her eyes from the sun. It was the first daylight she'd seen in months. No one moved. Not even the journalists, watching from behind barricades. Cameras rolled silently. It felt more like a funeral than a rescue. Then another stepped out. And another. Hostages. Live. On the other side, an armored convoy pulled up. Inside, Palestinian prisoners, some jailed for months, others for years. They were not allowed to speak. No flags, no shouting. They were handed over quietly, loaded into vans, and driven away. Each van marked only with a code number. No names. One of the Israeli negotiators whispered into a headset, "Stage 1 complete." But as soon as the exchange ended, something changed. Hamas fighters didn't disappear. They moved, repositioning. In tunnels, on rooftops, into zones that were supposed to be vacated. Intelligence noticed it immediately. And the fear returned. Was this a reorganization? Or a preparation? Meanwhile, back in Israel, the news broke live. Crowds erupted. Cheers. Applause. But also confusion. "Only 8?" one reporter asked. "Where are the rest?" The deal was clear. The rest would come in waves, if both sides honored the timeline. One violation and the entire process could be cancelled. Families gathered outside hospitals, holding on to hope like it was oxygen. Inside the war cabinet, Netanyahu was briefed. "We've made it through the first checkpoint. But it only gets harder from here." He nodded. Because this wasn't a rescue, it was a chain reaction. And with every new release, pressure would grow. Emotions would swell. Demands would rise. And the quiet would become more unbearable than the bombs ever were. At 2:37 p.m., an encrypted message appeared on a private journalist's Telegram channel. Clause 12. Israel agrees to reassess permanent withdrawal in exchange for phased hostage release. Within 15 minutes, it was viral. Within 30, the Prime Minister's office was on lockdown. Because Clause 12 wasn't supposed to exist. The ceasefire was only 2 days old. The first hostages had returned. The shelling had stopped. And for a brief moment, both sides had stepped back from the abyss. But now, with a single leak, everything was on the verge of disintegration. The phrase, "reassess permanent withdrawal," sent shockwaves through Israel's far-right coalition. It was interpreted, deliberately or not, as a soft commitment to ending the war. And for those who had built their political careers on no compromise, it was treason. Inside the Knesset, chaos broke out. One lawmaker slammed the document on the podium and screamed, "This deal was signed in secret. We were never told about Clause 12. Netanyahu's office issued a fast, sterile denial. There is no secret agreement. All terms are public and aligned with national security. But it was too late. Screens across Israel showed side-by-side footage, the hostages being wheeled into hospitals, and the leaked document flashing behind reporters. The image was seared into public consciousness. Hope and suspicion intertwined. Who leaked it? Initial reports pointed toward a rogue defense official, someone angry at the direction the ceasefire was heading. But internal security suspected something more calculated, a political maneuver to fracture Netanyahu's already crumbling coalition before his meeting with Trump. The Americans were furious. Steve Witkoff, speaking off the record, said, "This was supposed to be airtight. If this leak burns the deal, we're out." In Gaza, Hamas's response was immediate and chilling. They paused the next scheduled hostage release. No threats, no statements, just silence. Qatar scrambled to re-establish the link. A midnight call was placed between Doha and Tel Aviv, demanding clarity. If this clause is being denied publicly, Qatar warned, Hamas will view it as betrayal. Back in Israel, Netanyahu was running out of room. If he admitted the clause, he could lose his government. If he denied it, the hostage releases would stop. One advisor leaned in during a closed security meeting and said the unthinkable. This leak may have just restarted the war. Outside, the protests returned, but now divided. Some called for more transparency. Others demanded an end to the ceasefire altogether. Streets once unified in grief were now fractured by doubt. Inside military intelligence, analysts reviewed intercepted messages from Gaza. One in particular stood out. It was short, chilling. The clause was always the test. They failed it. Netanyahu made one final call that night, to Dermer in Washington. His voice was low, tired. "They want blood. I'm trying to give them breath." But now the breath was short, and the walls were closing in. Because in wars like this, it's not bombs that break peace. It's secrets. 3:11 a.m. A jet landed at a military airstrip outside Cairo. No flags. No media. On board, a U.S. envoy, a Mossad officer, and a Qatari negotiator. 3 men who didn't speak the same language, except when the subject was war. Waiting for them was Egypt's shadow diplomat, a man who hadn't been seen publicly in over a year. He offered no handshake. Only words. "We have 18 hours to fix this. After that, it all burns." The ceasefire clock was slipping. After the Clause 12 leak, Hamas had frozen the second phase of hostage releases. 8 more lives, alive, confirmed, waiting, now hung in limbo. Hamas wasn't threatening retaliation. Not yet. But they'd made their position clear. Deny the clause publicly, and we consider the deal broken. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu was walking a tightrope made of glass. The far right demanded he tear the deal up. International allies begged him not to. Every option came with consequences. Every choice meant blood somewhere. Back in Cairo, the room was cold, the tone colder. The Egyptian mediator handed out revised terms, modified language for Clause 12 that kept the essence, but masked the optics. Instead of permanent withdrawal, it now read, phased de-escalation measures aligned with mutual benchmarks toward long-term calm. It was pure diplomatic camouflage, deliberately vague but acceptable on both sides. The U.S. envoy leaned in. "Will Hamas buy it?" The Egyptians smiled faintly. They wrote it. But there was still a problem. Trust. Or rather, the absence of it. Hamas wanted an external enforcer, a party that would monitor the ceasefire, verify timelines, and publicly report violations. They didn't trust Israel. And Israel sure as hell didn't trust Hamas. That's when Cairo offered a wild card. A multinational observer team. Comprised of Egyptian, Qatari, and UN delegates, they would physically be present at every phase of the deal. Hostage releases, troop withdrawals, aid shipments. Real bodies. Real eyes. Israel was hesitant. "We don't want foreign boots near our lines." The U.S. envoy countered. "Then you don't want your people back." The room went quiet. The Egyptian diplomat wrote one word on a notepad and slid it forward. It read, "Neutrality." After 5 hours, an agreement was reached, on paper. The observers would monitor. The language would change. But none of it mattered unless Hamas moved. The Cairo team sent the terms directly to Gaza through a hardwired channel. No satellites. No leaks. 4 hours passed. Then, just before dawn, the reply came. "We accept. Next release at sundown." The ceasefire held barely. Back in Gaza, the 8 hostages were moved to a safe house under Red Crescent protection. In Tel Aviv, the security cabinet received the update. No applause. Just breath exhaled like smoke. One official said, "Cairo saved it." Another corrected him. "Cairo delayed it." Because with every compromise made, new pressure built beneath the surface. And now there was only one phase left. The most dangerous one. The van was white. No markings. No escort. It rolled slowly down the fractured road outside Khan Yunis at exactly 5:58 p.m., 2 minutes before sundown. Inside, the final 4 hostages. 3 men, 1 teenage girl. All of them alive. All of them broken in ways no camera would ever capture. This was supposed to be the end. The final exchange. The moment the world could breathe again. And then it happened. Boom. Low, deep earth-shaking. Somewhere behind the convoy, a fireball erupted skyward. Smoke spiraled. Dust choked the wind. Within seconds, the ceasefire teetered on the edge of total collapse. Was it a missile? A sabotage? A mistake? No one knew. And in those first 30 seconds of chaos, what mattered wasn't the explosion itself, but what people believed it was. In Tel Aviv, alarms triggered. Military units scrambled. In Gaza, Hamas fighters retreated into tunnels, fearing betrayal. Communication lines froze. The final hostages were immediately redirected to a fallback location. A single wrong interpretation, and the war would reignite in seconds. Inside Israel's military command, Netanyahu's advisors screamed into headsets. "Hold fire. Hold fire. Confirm origin first." In a bunker beneath Gaza City, the engineer, Hamas's silent strategist, gave one order. "Do not respond until we see the body count." The explosion, as it turned out, wasn't a missile. It was a gas tank in a civilian truck. Accidental, tragic, but not hostile. But no one on the ground knew that yet. And fear has a faster trigger than facts. The ceasefire clock was in its last hour. The final exchange was underway. But now everyone was frozen. Until one decision changed everything. Came from Cairo. Egypt's field liaison, stationed with the multinational observers, sent a live video stream directly to both Hamas and Israel. It showed the aftermath. Civilians running. No drones. No aircraft. No shrapnel. It was not an attack. The feed stabilized. Time-stamped. Verified. Cairo spoke into both channels. If we react now, we return to war. If we pause now, we reach peace. And for the second time in 10 days, they both paused. 1 hour later, the white van rolled again. Quiet. Undisturbed. At the Gaza-Israel border, Red Crescent officials stepped out, their hands raised. The first hostage emerged. frail, blinking, alive. Then the second, third, and finally the girl. On the Israeli side, no cheers. No music. Just stunned silence. This was what victory looked like now. Exhausted bodies, empty streets, the air trembling with what might have been. The ceasefire held. No formal handshake. No podium speech. Just quiet. Behind the scenes, the final documents were signed. Aid convoys were cleared. Observers moved into permanent posts. But the scar remained. 57,000 dead. Millions displaced. And two sides, forever changed by a deal that came within inches of destruction. Twice. And though the war had paused, it hadn't ended. Because real peace isn't ink on paper. It's what happens next. And in the shadows of silence, something still waits.